Hi, everybody. First, thank you, Susanna, for and the whole committee organizing this event. I see also Peter Lemons, at least in front of me, one of the 9 images I can see. Hi. Thanks for inviting me and organizing this event. Actually, I've written a long paper. I can't read, of course. So you will get a very abridged version. And unfortunately, I have to skip the last section on melancholy, on the melancholy form. Uh, which would perfectly resonate with Jean-Luc, but it makes no sense to skip other parts and to read this. So I'm sorry for this. But if you will hear the long version of the lecture, I will give it next week at a seminar at the seminar of aesthetics at Oslo University. It's also on the web. Ivan Rostad, I guess Ivan is also here, my host next week, and there I can give the full length of the paper. Uh, but in what follows, I mean, let me give you a brief overview for the beginning. I think in one aspect, it also resonates with Jean-Luc's paper, which I enjoyed very much to hear. Jean-Luc was just speaking about the jump does a nouvelle era or age, jump into the unthinkable where no sense is coming or arriving. And I guess I'm heading towards also this problem. I will be presenting Bernard's reflections on the worldlessness and epochlessness, the absence of world and epoch, at the end of Anthropocene in which we live. They constitute, I guess, both absence of world and epoch, the final figure, the apex of the thinking of suspension that emerges in his work, I guess, and that from the beginning represents one of the peculiar aspects and central conceptual stakes of his oeuvre. This diagnosis, which ultimately replaces the concept of the Anthropocene with that of the Anthropocene, as most of you might know, and characterizes our present as a careless untime that Stiegler simply calls the disruption. This puts the final point on his broad work on technologically redefining historicality and grounds, I guess, his re-articulation of the relationship between techniques and time. So that's the picture I want to develop now. I start with a short introduction, a thinking of epochs. A long quotation from the chapter on the change of epoch, the exigency of return in Maurice Blanchot's The Infinite Conversation marks the threshold of techniques and time. I repeat the title of Blanchot, On a Change of Epoch, the Exigency of Return. The passage, a dialogue about the end of history brought about by modern technology and about the extreme danger that characterizes this transition between different ages, stands emblematically above the general introduction to Stiegler's multi-volume project. It is the cue for an entire oeuvre subsequently pursued in numerous ramifications, an oeuvre that in a sense will have been a vast interpretation of Blanchot's reflection on the change of epoch. Incipit as follows, and I read a longer quotation from Blanchot. Will you allow us a certainty that we are at a turning point? And the dialogue partner answers, it is a certainty, then if it is a certainty, then it is not a turning. The fact of our belonging to this moment at which a change of epoch, if there is one, is being accomplished, also takes hold of the certain knowledge that would want to determine it, making both certainty and uncertainty inappropriate. Never are we less able to outline ourselves than at such a moment. And the discrete force of the turning point lies first in this. End of quote. In the years that separate us from Blanchot's reflections in the 1960s and that have had led us into the new computational condition, this difficult task of outlining ourselves in the moment of turning has become an almost impossible challenge. The we that is to be outlined and reconstituted is as such falling apart, undone by all kinds of processes of disintegration Blanchot could not have dreamed of. This disintegration of the we is and maybe the essential moment of the turning. Yet Stiegler accepts the challenge, accepts it at the task that defines his life as a philosopher. The problem of the change of epoch, like it is called by Blanchot, the problem of the change of epoch and the development of this problem in or as the question of epochality. This, both the problem and the question, this passage from the problem to the question, let's say, mark and situate Stiegler thinking from the outset and define its structure and becoming throughout all the phases it goes through, from the technological to the pharmacological, organological, and finally to the neganthropological phase, like Dan Ross has written about these three phases. Let me come to my first chapter, a thinking of suspension, exploring the logic of epochs. The thinking of epochal change proposes in what I would like to call, at least for the moment, his thinking of suspension, begins with an absolutely subversive re-articulation of the problem of epoche that gives rise to his unique philosophical, diagnostic, and political project. For him, epoche is no longer, as it is for Husserl, a methodological principle of parenthesizing or exclusion of the natural world, of what is already there, present at hand. No longer an operation of a transcendental ego that achieves the transition from the natural to the apex so far of the theoretical attitude. Prior to every epoche, and as its original supplement, we might say, there is something Stiegler calls objective epoche. Epoche objective. This objective epoche, prompted by thrusts of exteriorization on the part of technical objects, or later in the terms he borrows from Lotka, this turns out to be the heretofore unthought condition of the epoch, the foundation of all epochality. This reversal of the problem of epoche, which shifts from subjective epoche as a methodology to objective epoche as a central moment of history, initially grounds his pharmacological organological work, which, starting in Disorientation, the second volume of Technics and Time, exhaustively presents the development and ramification of this reversal. I say initially because, as we will see, the transition to the neganthropological phase will take up the epoche problem once more, refine it conceptually, and make it the decisive moment in the historical definition of our present as being without epoch and without world. The central concept in this vast effort now of re-articulation, which both technicizes and politicizes phenomenology, is epochal redoubling. The reflection on epochal redoubling, redoublement epochal, if I'm not mistaken, does not emerge this orientation. There is the essential moment that lifts the problem of the change of epoch onto a new conceptual level that would shape Stiegler thinking all the way to his philosophical political strategies. The decisive passage reads as follows, and I quote a longer quote from La Désorientation. In Fault of Epimetheus, I demonstrated that the reification of a technical propensity or body of propensities leading to an altered technical system suspends the behavioral programming through which the society is united, and which is a form of objective epoche the social body initially tends to resist. An adjustment then takes place in which an epochal intensification, redoublement epochal, occurs. This adjustment is the epoche's key accomplishment, in which the who appropriates the effectivity of this suspension, that is, of programmatic indetermination for itself. And I go on with the quote, technical development is a violent disruption of existent programs that through redoubling give birth to a new programmatics. This new programmatics is a process of psychic and collective integration. Contemporary disorientation is the experience of an incapacity to achieve epochal redoubling. End of quote. I thought, wow, already in 1996, I thought during the last month, already in 1996, he was writing this, opening up all the way for his further work, I guess. Even in the first volume of Technics and Time, of course, is at its core, this is already marked by a conspicuous semantics of doubling. The legendary doubling mark of the lonely figure of Prometheus by that of Epimetheus, the double fold at the origin, which in an originary doubling up makes Prometheus' fold appear as a doubling up of Epimetheus' fold, etc. And even if this semantics begins to trace the signature of Stiegler thinking of the technological, only the second volume, I would say, endows this basic problem with the necessary conceptual precision. In disorientation, Stiegler transforms the problem of the change of epoch, Blanchot is speaking of, into the question of the change of epoch, which allows for thinking this change, penser with an E, but thereby also for healing it and caring for it, penser with an A. This is one of his last key conceptual developments, I guess. So epochal redoubling here serves as the decisive formula for unlocking the sense of epochal change as a transformative sense that lays out the movement of transformation in precise detail as the basic historical movement. And at the same time, it develops a new perspective of problematization introduced by objective epoche in the direction of a vast diagnosis of the epoch yet to be given and of a downright politics of epoche. I quote him again. If techne suspends the programs in force, then knowledge also returns to suspend all stable effects, techne's repercussions, by redoubling them. This is epochal redoubling, also the second volume. And watch out, he speaks about knowledge returns. That's exactly the return Blanchot is speaking about. Linear, and I go on with quote, linear phonological writing is a programmatic epoche suspending all forms of a heritage that is itself programmatic, but as such does not appear to be, and which in suspension programs another vestige of the past, of anticipation, and consequently of a present conceived as presence. Which idea of today then would improbably program the epochal redoubling of different analogic, numeric, and biologic identities, thus throwing into crisis the presence of which today consists, he asks, end of quote. In the notion of a crisis of the present, this points to a threat to, if not destruction, of the capacity for epochal redoubling. A fundamental disorientation around which all of Stiegler's critical project, and as we will see, his politics henceforth revolve. This destruction of the capacity for epochal redoubling. And this precisely is what he elaborates single-mindedly in the last stage of his oeuvre, more precisely beginning with the transformation of his pharmacological or chronological thinking into the neganthropological critique of the Anthropocene under the heading of being in disruption. So, and in a wonderful text on Charlie Parker and the gramophone, Bernard presents the movement of redoubling in more detail. Here he writes, the endurance of the improbable, that is to say, the suspension of programs, clichés, attitudes, gestures, prejudged words and actions, badly repeated stereotypes. The endurance of the improbable stems from what philosophy calls epoche, from Common Greek. Epoche means at once an interruption, the suspension of judgment and the state of doubt, the point in the sky where a star seems to stop, a period of time, an epoch, an era. And then end of quote, having indicated the philosophical use of the word, especially Husserl's use of epoche, of course, as and Heidegger's reformulation of the question of epoche, as he writes in terms of epochs of being and the withdrawal of being, Stiegler emphatically returns to his own use of the term. Quote, epoche, as I have come to use the word here, is first the very actuality of historical time, history in action, this epoch without the succession of epochs. That is how we understand the primary sense of the word today. But to return to philosophical tradition and against it, my aim is to argue that just as Charlie Parker made history with his saxophone and another instrument, the phonograph, I love this passage, epoche is always double and always supposes an epochal technological ground. Techne suspends an epoch from techne, techne makes epoche, and in this suspension there is an improbable response, a linkage, a making of time. It is epoche that makes an epoch. End of quote. I come to my third and last point. Being in the disruption, in the worldlessness and epochlessness of the Anthropocene. The full stakes of Stiegler's thinking of suspension are apparent where it develops its diagnostic power to define the present epoch. A present epoch, as we will see, that marks the limit of the logic of epochs as such, marks its nihilistic ending as non-epoch or without epoch. In German, we can say das Epochenlose. It's a very nice word. It didn't exist, so but I speak about actually in German about das Epochenlose Stieglers. So it's not really, I'm not able to translate it, but the without epoch is quite close, I think. This diagnosis is organized by the definition of the doubly epochal redoubling, which it forcefully reasserts and elaborates in broader and now and more profound terms. It is the doubly epochal redoubling, and it is precisely this what Stiegler designates as the key characteristic of our today. It is the doubly epochal redoubling that is pierced, damaged, put into question as such. This displaces the very logic of epochs, which is founded on that redoubling and supports the movement of historicality as a whole. The diagnostic sense of Stiegler's rethinking of the epoch or the change of epoch, to come back to this, which ultimately defines the heritage of his prodigious elaboration of the question of technics and time, culminates in this diagnosis, a diagnosis that ultimately appears as the horizon of the question of techniques and time as such, and as that which is at stake in and compels the elaboration of that question. The outlining of what I call the untime of epochlessness, by the way, the once again, of a double fault of time and fault of epoch. This untime brings out the core of the entire enterprise, endows it with its urgency, reveals its historical signature to be the collapse of historicality as well as of temporalization, a collapse it allows us to think. Now, what does epochlessness mean precisely? And why can it be characterized as an untime? If the improbable, indeterminate,
you cannot be here.
Sir, put off your sound. Put back the mic, please. No. Very strange, we can't hear you.
No.
Vous devez rebrancher votre.
Is your mic?
Yes.
Muted or?
Well, this is very strange. Your mic is muted.
I see that your mic is muted.
Non, je pense qu'il a le fil est débranché, certainement.
It is muted, so you should be able to unmute it. Can you unmute it, Susanna or Donovan?
No, it's muted from his end.
Oh, okay. Then he should.
Please unmute yourselves, maybe with a...
Can you hear us?
Yeah.
You have to wrench your...
Maybe you
Oh,
should disconnect your whole headset and try to speak different.
Can you
no,
speak?
no. Maybe you should... No. Sorry. Maybe you should go just out and come back, and sometimes that helps. So
So you don't see the bar in the middle of the screen, or middle bottom of the screen? There's a bar, or there should be a bar. Okay, well.
just disappeared surprisingly.
Yeah, that's weird.
Um,
Maybe indeed to check out and check in again. Or...
yes,
Now it's okay. Now it's okay, right?
Now
Okay, we hear you. Your image is not moving, so I don't know why, but you can speak at least.
Hear me now
Oh,
again,
yes.
right?
Another image that where
Okay.
you can see.
I'm sorry, it just happened, and it was not. I was not able to control anything here. You know, I don't know. I didn't do anything. So okay. So where have I been?
You have been trolled.
Gosh, this was the most complicated sentence of the whole piece. A very long one.
Yeah, there's also a picture that doesn't move. You are there 2 times for me at least, but just continue. Don't worry.
Okay. I don't know. Wait. I don't know what happened.
It doesn't matter. You can just continue.
Okay. Okay. So if ask what does this epochs mean precisely? You hear me, right? So if the improbable, indeterminate answer to the suspension is not given and the change of epochs does not succeed, if therefore the technological interruption of the program of tradition of inheritance of the systems of care that together make up an immortality is absolute, that is, if there is disruption, and if all epochality threatens to burst, all existence starts to dissolve in an epochal void bereft of responses and responsibilities, and all consistency begins to get loose, then, that's the point, then we find ourselves in the infinite deformation and interruption of epochlessness, such as it characterizes our being in disruption. Stiegler describes as our contemporary condition of being. This means that not every interruption, of course, that inaugurates an epoch is disruptive. There is disruption only when the interruption cannot be redoubled and an absolute void of thinking is permitted. That disruption is thus a historical definition through and through, and the detailed analysis of the doubly epochal redoubling in Dans la Disruption refers to the 2 temporalities that interlock here, technological time on the one hand, and the time of knowledge of forms of life and of thinking on the other. In disruption, the second time of epochal redoubling is lacking. There is no longer a time of transitivation, only the untime of disindividuation. The wheel loses its consistency. This is the problem at the center of Stiegler's last work, which undertakes to elaborate the question of the completed nihilism of the computational Gestell, an undertaking he places quite logically under the heading of an absence of epoch. This was a quote, of course, of Bernard. The loss of world that Heidegger in his thinking of the Gestell problematized as the horizon of technicized modernity and its boisterous effort of a world transformation, the loss, Gérard Granel, one of Stiegler's most important teachers, then reconstructed as a great process of unworlding, resulting from the conjunction of infinitization operated by techniques and capital at the same time, this de-worlding in Stiegler becomes total and the final consequence of epochal absence in the disruptions. What is without epoch, I would like to say with this, is without world. In other words, Stiegler's thinking of epoch-lessness appears as an interpretation and conceptualization of the problem of unworldliness. Stiegler understands this absence above all as an, quote, absence of shared and cultivated pretensions, end of quote, that are replaced by the automatic pretensions of algorithmic governmentality and the restriction of horizons of expectation of futurality and of time generally. The time form that characterizes the basic historical ontological constitution of disruption, what Rouvroy and Masumi call preemption, Hansen feed forward, and Stiegler himself tertiary pretension. To give you some examples of this time form emerging with the computational Gestell, so the time form of environmentality untimely proves to be an unform of detemporalization that casts a fundamental absence over the entire epoch, which thereby completely turns into epochlessness. So the foregrounding of tertiary pretensions by digitality and their industrialization and automatization by algorithmic governmentality, all this dislodges the epoch-making character of the retentional apparatuses operating in historical ages. According to Stiegler, the accumulation of collective retentions and pretensions, which make up a retentional apparatus, and quote, forms epochs, end of quote. Epochs are constituted by the division of retentions and pretensions, and the computational tertiary pretensions are disruptive because they assume control of this division. In the absence of epoch, he writes, where nothing can be acknowledged, nothing can happen, end of quote. Concentrated in the concept of the absence of epoch, we find the immense philosophical diagnosis of the coming untime, strictly speaking, the untime of the non-event, which first began in Technics and Time 1, but reaching its destination only now. The generalized denuetization and total proletarization that undermine the process of doubly epochal redoubling result in the, quote, non-individuation that is, he writes, the absence of epoch, end of quote. So absence of epoch then is the name of the devastation wrought by the absolute disruption which perfects the technological nihilism of being in disruption. We live in the impossible epoch of the absence of epoch, in the fault of epoch in which no consisting succeeds that might otherwise form an epoch, and in which the we of an epoch might appear. I will finish in a moment. This sheds new light also in emphatic, especially on the problem of care. It might even make it the central theme of our epoch, if we can still put it like that, our epoch. Quote, such an absence of epoch is affected more than ever by the problem and by the question of care, end of quote, Stiegler. The question of care is quite simply the question of epochlessness and thereby our question. Even if this we, whose problem and the question it is increasingly absent as a consequence of the general carelessness. However, by itself, the forceful appearance of the problem and the question of care already points to our entry into the untime of disruption. It is this epoch, time, and carelessness that Stiegler finally addresses as the last stage, not of the Anthropocene, but of the Anthropocene. Characterized this way, the Anthropocene can just, as he says, okay, I have to read the quote, sorry. Quote, the Anthropocene then is what is best characterized as a liquidation of localities and a generalized and planetary increase of thermodynamic entropy as an increased dissipation of energy, a biological entropy as a destruction of biodiversity, and of informational entropy as a destruction of no diversity, so a threefold entropy. Characterized this way, he writes, the Anthropocene calls just can just as well be called Anthropocene, end of quote. Especially the loss of no diversity and the general denuetization in the digital disruption that, according to Stiegler, implement a structural carelessness, put our responsibility, understood in the sense of a doubly epochal redoubling, as our ability to respond to the change of being put into question. This structural carelessness put our responsibility at stake in its entirety, and with it our capacity for transforming becoming into future, entropy into negantropy. Conversely, the central challenge of the Anthropocene is the search for the possibility, he writes, the search, quote, for the possibility of a new type of doubly epochal redoubling in the absence of epoch, end of quote. I mean, this is the very condensation of the question of care for him. What Stiegler then calls the neganthropological difference we are looking for. At issue are improbable responses to the disruption that bring about a new great transformation. This precisely is why our position in the history of sense might be that of a transformative sense that usher us into a new epoch, the curative, quote Stiegler, the curative, careful epoch, end of quote, of the neganthropocene. I guess I have to stop here because half an hour is over. Thank you very much for listening.